announcement and then captions. Okay, so I want to start off with a few announcements. So, okay. Let's go to the class website. So you do have a couple of assignments due this week. I see at least one person has already submitted here it is, the Canvas assignment that you're going to be looking at those two written sources, the James W. Jacks letter. I've also gone in and added a file of that letter in Word so that it's easier to read. If you find this first link hard to read, try the Word file and see if that makes it better. If it's somehow still causing problems, let me know and I can try I can try something else. Then you're going to read the response to Jacks by a Black activist, by Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, and answer these questions. And I want to note that on question number 4, I asked, describe the political and cultural context in which these letters were written. What I'm asking you to talk about is kind of basically the lecture information for Tuesday, right? To talk about that context, right? But in your own words, right? I want to make sure that you understand what the context is that these letters were written. And so what I'm talking about is really stuff from the lectures, right? What's the historical background? What was going on at this time that leads to this exchange between Jacks and Black activists, right? If you have any questions as you're working through this, please let me know on the files or the questions, anything like that. The other thing you have this week is the one reading. It's Hinojosa from her memoir. It's chapter 6 and 7. So at this point, I think you all are pretty good with what you're doing with the Hinojosa reading. So again, mostly along with the 3 comments, I want you to keep the prompt in mind so that by the time you get to answering that final paper or writing that final paper, you don't have to come back and reread any of the book. That's the point of reading it little by little throughout the semester, is that you're kind of making notes that will help you with the prompt at the end of the semester. However, I do want to point out, okay, that we have a few things coming up in the next few weeks. So for example, week 7, we're going to meet on Tuesday, but on Thursday, I'll actually make a note here. We're not going to meet on Thursday. I'm just going to ask you to watch a documentary and then answer questions on the documentary. So you'll see that I didn't assign any reading for next week, right? It's kind of because we're going to have kind of a half week. So although I'm asking you to do something, I'm basically going to give you the class period on Thursday to watch it. Part of why I'm doing that is that I have a conference in a couple of weeks. And on that Thursday, I'm going to be traveling. I'm going to be traveling because my conference is in Mexico. Right? So I'm going to be in Mexico for basically all of week 8. On the other hand, so we won't have any official class that week. Right. Instead, I'm going to give you that that class time to watch a documentary. Right. So before we watch documentary, though, I'll give you information on it because you're going to write your midterm, your midterm paper on that documentary. But if for anybody that's been looking ahead, the documentary paper is not just to give me like a summary of the documentary. I'm going to ask you to make connections between the documentary and the topics we've been talking about in class. So I'm going to guide you through how to do that before you even watch the documentary. Somebody has a question? Okay, Gael, I see your comment. So although we won't meet in class that day or during week 8, I will be on Zoom. Part of why I didn't, it's not going to be a mandatory attendance on those days. It's because since I'm at a conference, I don't know what my internet reception is going to be. Last time I was at a conference and doing class online, the internet was so bad that I couldn't share my screen. Like nobody could see what was on the screen. And so to avoid that, those kinds of troubles, I just decided that class will not be mandatory. But I will be on Zoom. I will be on Zoom even if I have to use, my phone for the internet. I will be on Zoom so that if anybody has questions on the documentary, on the prompt for the documentary, I will be online that week to talk about it. Then week 9, I will be back. We will be back on live Zoom class and talking about the documentary prompt. So we're basically, I'm going to try to talk about the documentary and the paper before you watch it. And then afterwards, most of week 9 is going to be spent talking about what my expectations are for that paper. Right, so anybody that works ahead can absolutely work ahead, but if not, I'm still going to be kind of guiding you through what you're supposed to be doing, what the process step by step. So I kind of wanted to give you a preview of what's happening in the next coming weeks. Does anybody have questions about that schedule? So I will post an email reminders about like which days we are not meeting so that you know ahead of time, but it is posted here on Canvas. So you can make a note, for example, that on week 8, class is not mandatory. I'm not going to be doing a lecture, nothing like that. You just are supposed to be making time to watch the documentary. So if you don't have any other time in your schedule, at least use the class period to watch the documentary. No questions, comments, concerns?
Hi, Professor.
Yeah.
So this is for week 7, yes?
This is for week 7 and 8. Week 7, yeah.
All right,
week 8 is
week 8 is submitting the midterm paper?
You're submitting the midterm paper week 9, so October 22nd.
Oh, so we have 2 weeks to work on the midterm paper.
Yep, actually like 2.5, a little bit more, but yes.
And it's mostly based on the documentary?
It's half based on the documentary. So actually I can talk about it a little bit now. So it's going to be a 2 to 4 page paper in which you answer the prompt, how is today's prison industrial complex connected, not just to the history of slavery, but also to the history of excluding and incarcerating non-white bodies. So some of the information you're going to get from the documentary, but I'm going to ask you to also connect it to some of the things we've been talking about in class.
Okay, so half of our evidence is going to be coming straight from the book we've been doing for the past couple of weeks, and the other half will be citations or taking from the documentary. Something like that.
You can use the reading. So half of it is going to be from the documentary and the other half from lecture. I would say lecture more than the book, but you can 100% use the book.
So we can also cite the conversation and
yes.
what we're doing?
Yes. Yes. So it is not a research paper, right? I'm not going to be requiring that you do any outside research outside of the class, but you can definitely cite the lecture material, the conversations, and any of the readings.
I see. 2 to 4, connecting history. Okay. All right.
Yeah. And
this is just supposed to be an informational?
No, argumentative. I'm going to, you have to make an argument.
That makes it easier. All right.
I'm like, for you, it might be easier, but I know for a lot of you, by the way, for those of you looking at this prompt and thinking, wait, it's not just going to be information. If anybody's scared about it, you're going to have to give me your own assessment and you make an argument based on the information. But for people that might be scared of that, I'm going to guide you through it. But like Seth, if that looks easy, I'm like, you can get started on it right away.
Maybe it's just because my junior or high school teacher kept pressuring us to keep doing argumentative essays in high school.
Which is good, right? The more you practice making your own argument, the better. Make it all up. It's not make it all up, but you know, here's the thing: for a lot of people that if you haven't practiced making these arguments, it feels like making it up because you're having to make connections. And what that is thinking about it, right? It's looking at the evidence and then making the connections that are required in there. It feels like making it up, but you still have to provide evidence from the history. Right? You have to provide evidence from the documentary and from lectures. So it's still evidence-based. But for some of you who are more in the STEM field, it feels like making it up, except the data is still there, right? The data is still there. So what are you arguing? Everybody can argue a completely different thing. That's the beauty of it, right? Because I don't want to read 40 papers that are all exactly the same. The beauty of it is that you can all focus on different aspects of the information and still have an argument. So your argument should answer this question, the question that's in bold. right? How is today's prison industrial complex, basically, how is our prison system connected to the history of slavery and the history of racism in this country, right? But I'm translating the question here. I'm asking you, how is our prison system connected to the history of slavery and the history of racism in our country? The documentary is going to focus a lot on the history of slavery, right? But part of what I want you to think about is that it's not just about the history of slavery, it's the history of excluding Asian Americans, right? How the history of Chinese exclusion is part of, can help us understand today's prison system. The history of racism against Mexican Americans, right? I feel like all of that history is actually connected to it, as well as the history of slavery. Okay, those of you that are thinking it's easy, perfect. I'm glad it's easy for you. But those of you looking at this and thinking it's not easy, don't listen to them. I'm going to walk you through this step by step, and I will give you examples of like what a thesis looks like, what I expect your thesis to look like, and how to cite, and what to put in body paragraphs. I will walk you through it. So for those of you that are like, that sounds easy, great. You can zoom out while I talk about those things. But for everybody else, we're gonna go through it. And I don't intend this to be hard, right? I don't intend this assignment to be hard. So perfect for those of you that are thinking it's easy, but I know it's not easy for everybody. So. But how have you not written a single essay this year? Okay, we're gonna. Well, obviously, I will change that. This week, though, just to be clear, this weekend you have one Canvas assignment and one document to read on perusal. Right, all of that is for the next 2-3 weeks. I don't want to confuse anyone. All right, let's see. So let's get back to where we are. We're not right. In order to get to the prison system here, we also have to get through the world wars. And like I said, the world wars mark a major shift. And one of the keys in this major shift is that it's not just a shift in American history, it's a global shift in global dynamics, political, economic, social, and cultural dynamics shift at a global scale. Because although there are wars that are historians have argued are much more global in scale than we give them credit for, this is the first one where there's absolutely no doubt this is a global war, right? And you've already kind of brought up on Tuesday what made it global. A lot of it is a system of alliances, right? Especially within Europe. But then the colonial project that those European countries had embarked on, right? All the major European players in World War I had colonies, vast colonies in some cases, and they bring in the colonies into the war then because the manpower was needed, right? The other thing that nobody brought up in terms of the cost of World War I, though, is nationalism. And that's related to the issue of militarism, right? I mentioned how if you build a large military, you're going to use it. This is just something we see over and over in global history. People don't build a military to just have it sit and do nothing. So where does nationalism come in? Nationalism was still a pretty new concept in 1914, right? Because the first nation states that were created in global history were the United States, France, and Haiti, right? And think about when those countries were first created: 1776, 1789, 1804. So there was that idea of a nation state was still actually pretty new when you look at human history. But the idea, one of the key points behind nationalism is that people believe that their country, right, the outlines, the borders that have been designated as a country, is better than all other countries, right? That's a key aspect of nationalism. And it plays a major role here because going into the war, most people believed that this was going to be a short war. They're willing to volunteer for the military. They're willing to support the war effort. At the breakout of World War I, there was major support for the war effort, not just in Europe, but all over the world. Why? Because people thought that the country that they were connected to, that they were a part of, was going to win. They thought this is going to be an easy war. We're so much better than all the other nation states. And so it leads to a huge support for the war initially, right? And so those two things, the nationalism and the militarism, are interconnected. Right away, though, we see nations selling the war to their citizens, right? Because part of what representative governments have to do is they have to get their nation on board. Especially in the United States, because the United States was so unwilling to enter the war initially, right? It has to be sold to them. And one of the ways in which the Allies sell the idea of World War I, especially in the US, so this is an American propaganda poster, is by making the case that the other side is acting barbaric. So let's look at this poster. So who is being accused of barbarism? Who's being accused of being barbaric in this poster? No one? The Germans, yes, Jackson, exactly. And not everybody might get some of the iconography of why it's the Germans that are being accused of being barbaric. But in World War I propaganda, you can always tell when the Germans are being depicted, in part because of this hat, right? This hat with a pointy top always indicates that is a German, right? And in the hat, the word militarism's there. So they're blaming Germany, and especially Germany's building up of a military, that is being blamed then as the ones being barbaric, right? And who is the victim of Germany's barbaric actions? This one might be a little bit harder, so I'm like, who do you think is the victim here of Germany's barbarism? America. Okay, that is absolutely a potential victim. Yes. Now, why? Why are we saying this is America, the victim of barbarism? I think you're right, but what? That's on the floor. America works. Yes. Okay, that is part of it. But also, how is America being depicted? So you have the words, but also this female figure, right? Isn't this female figure part of what the depiction of America? Fear that they will be overtaken, Armando. Absolutely, yes. What in this image shows us that there's a fear of the Germans overtaking? It's a kind of protect women, yeah, by showing the Germans holding this woman in danger, right? It's fear of women, but it's also kind of nation states being depicted as women. This is a very common way in which people depicted whatever their country is. Their countries usually get depicted as a woman, and if you're saying that your country's in danger, it's usually depicted in this way. At least it is true for the United States, and it's true for a lot of the Western countries, that they like depicting their country as in the woman figure. Right. And notice that not just any kind of woman figure, it's always a light-skinned woman, white woman, usually with the blonde hair. Right. That is typically how she's being depicted. And in this case, also nude. Why is a woman in this poster being depicted nude? Yes, Angel. It emphasizes the vulnerability of the country and of women, right? It's also a reminder, something that would have stood, that would people would have understood at the time was Germans being accused of sexual assault of especially Belgian women. And there is evidence, I mean, it did happen when the Germans marched into France. They marched through Belgium, from the Low Countries, the Netherlands and Belgium. And as they're marching through those countries, there is the rape of Belgian women. And so the treatment of Belgium in particular, you usually see in these propaganda posters to depict the Germans as barbaric. Look at how horrible they are. They are marching through Belgium, even though Belgium was neutral during the war. They're not respecting that neutrality or the national borders. They're coming in, destroying the country and raping the women. And part of the message then here in this poster is, do you want that to happen to the US? And what are people supposed to answer when they look at this poster and they say, hey, do you want the Germans to come over here, rape your women, and destroy the country? The answer is you're supposed to look at the poster and say, no. More than that, what is this poster telling you to do? You're not just supposed to say no, but what are you going to do about it? You're supposed to enlist. Yes, particular here, this is the US Army enlistment poster. Yeah. So this is definitely trying to to appeal to people's fear, right, of what will happen if Germany is allowed to continue unchecked, right? Making the case for why the US needs to enter the war and why men in particular need to be volunteering for the army. Now, let me ask you, let's say you are a person living in 1917 and you see posters like this. Is a poster alone going to lead you to go sign up for the army? You see this poster, and are you going to immediately go enlist? Like, the army still has a lot of posters and ads that they use to promote people enlisting. Careful consideration may follow. If you're following what's happened, then maybe, right? The way that the news was delivered about what was happening in Europe at the time was deliberately meant to appeal to people's sense of fairness and the way in particular that Belgium and France are being treated. And so if you've been following the news, chances are your sense of nationalism and sense of fairness might play a factor. Typically, though, news ads are not the only thing that is going to lead somebody to go enlist, right? There's a reason why there's still a draft, right? And part of what you see in World War I is that all of the countries involved do end up using a draft, because although there's an initial wave of volunteers, it's very quickly clear that it's not going to be enough, that an all-volunteer army in World War I was not sufficient, right, for any of the countries involved. These kinds of ads might appeal to people, but it's not automatically leading to every single man going and enlisting. The draft was still necessary. So I do need to point that out. But I said this is a global war, and part of what all the countries involved end up having to do is appeal to their colonies, initially by getting them to volunteer. Right? The initial push is to get people to volunteer. So this is the French poster, and you don't need to know any French. I will translate what the words here mean, but even if you don't know what the words mean, there's a very clear appeal being used here, right? This is a propaganda poster used by the French and distributed throughout their colonies. So tell me, what is the message being sent to the colonies? If you are a man or woman in the colonies, what was the message you're supposed to receive from this poster? No? What do you get from this poster? Oh, someone's in the colonies unite to fight for France. That is so well put, Angel. Yes. A unity amongst the colonies shall lead to the French victory. Absolutely, Dino. Yes, it's France because of the flag in the background, right? The blue, white, and red. And you don't need to know anything else, and it kind of is going to scream France. In addition, the words say 3 colors, 1 flag, 1 empire. Yes, you're red, white, and blue, but because it doesn't have stars or any kind of iconography, it means France. So the appeal here is, hey, we're all one. We're all united as one. And in fact, the 3 figures being depicted are chosen very specifically to signify the aspects of the empire, right? This figure here on the left-hand side is meant to be a North African, right? Kind of a very generic kind of North African man. The middle in the figure with darker skin is meant to be a West African. This is places where the French have the largest part of their empire. The French control large parts of North Africa, large parts of West Africa, and then Southeast Asia. Right. So this is what the three regions of the world where France has most of its empire, where they're supposed to signify. So it's like, hey, we're all one, united under one flag. Come fight for France. You are part of France. Now, is that true at this time? Is the empire united? Is there a sense, do you think there's a sense of nationalism within the French Empire, for example? People have a sense of, yes, let's go fight for France. We're all one, we're equal to the French. Now for the colonies, remember, yeah, the colonies are largely held together through military power. People don't want to be ruled by the French or the British or the Germans, right? They want independence. There was already independence movements happening throughout the French Empire. So this is actually a hard sell, right? It's hard to sell, come volunteer to fight for France, because these men are not going to be fighting primarily in their countries, right? They're going to be shipped outside of their countries, potentially to die fighting to preserve French independence, French freedom. Right? So it's actually a hard sell for these people. And yet there will be men from all of the French colonies that will volunteer to fight in the French army. Why? Why do you think there will be volunteers? There are volunteers from all of these regions of the world that end up fighting in the French military. Yes. Yes, Angel's giving you the answers really quick. Yeah, because it seems kind of, at first, it's kind of like, wait, what? You're here, you're controlling these parts of the world through military by force. You're forcing them under your rule. And then you're asking them to volunteer to fight? Well, most people are not going to do that. Angel, go ahead and teach the class. Except they offer. For some of these men, they offer them money. Right? They offer them money. So some men are going to do it because this is much, much better pay they're going to get in the military than anything they could find back home. For other men, it's the promise of citizenship. They are promised that if they fight in the French military, they will get citizenship and their families will get French citizenship. For some of these men, that is enough incentive, because when they are ruled by the French, they don't have rights of citizenship. They are colonial subjects, and it means they're extremely limited in the rights that they have. So the right of citizenship means access to better jobs, access to potentially migrate to France and have a better life. It means access to a lot more resources. And so weighed against the possibility of dying, for some people, it's worth it, right? Initially, there's also a sense of nationalism for some of them, because the propaganda was so strong, like France is being victimized by the Germans, come help save France, right? So there is a sense of nationalism that some of these men have, but for some of them, it's purely out of self-interest. They know that they can get something out of serving in France, right? Now, I'm gonna come back to this slide, but one of the things that's really interesting in terms of American history and American servicemen is the experience of African American soldiers when they're fighting in France, right? Large part of World War I is fought in France because the Germans invade through the Low Countries, so up north through the Netherlands and Belgium, and then they're stopped in northern France, right? Where the two sides basically dig trenches and end up in prolonged trench warfare. So it's a stalemate for years in the trenches. When the US finally enters the war, right, that's part of the situation that they're facing. So a lot of African American soldiers are now fighting in France, right? And the first quote here is a direct quote from an African American soldier who fought in France. And he said, quote, "These French people don't bother with no color line business. They treat us so good that the only time I ever know I'm colored is when I look in the glass." Right? Now, the American military is still segregated at this point. It's still very heavily segregated, and African American soldiers are experiencing a lot of racism in the American military. When, in fact, the American military is so segregated and so full of racism that when French military authorities see the way African American soldiers are treated, they are shocked. They're shocked at the racism and segregation in the U.S. Army, right? W.E.B. Du Bois also sees the experience of African American soldiers who fight in France, though, and this is what he says. He says, "Vive la France! Mine eyes have seen, and they were filled with tears. Men of Africa, how fine a thing to be a Black Frenchman in 1919. Imagine such a celebration in America." What they're expressing here, right, what the African American soldier and W.E.B. Du Bois are expressing is, while in France, Black soldiers were not treated with racism. Not by the French people, right? By the American military, they were, but by French people, they are not. And French military authorities are expressing what a terrible situation it is, the way these soldiers are treated in the US, right? Now, does this mean that the French are not racist? Oh, Jackson, we'll talk to that in a second. Yeah. So a lot of African American soldiers fighting in France are saying that they are not being treated with racism by the French people. Does that mean the French are not racist? Thank you, Jackson, because this is the thing, right? I'm like, wait a minute. I'm like, whenever you want to say someone's not being racist, it's always a huge no, probably not correct.
Oh.
No. So this does not mean that the French are not racist, but they were not acting racist towards the African American soldiers. They were not. French women are celebrating American soldiers, and that includes the African American soldiers. A lot of Black soldiers, Black American soldiers, end up having sexual relationships with French women, white French women. They end up getting married to white French women. A lot of them actually bring their French wives back to the US after the war. A lot of them are so impressed with the lack of racism they experienced in France that a lot of African American soldiers stay in France at the end of the war. Right? We have a huge number of American expats living in France in the interwar period, and a large part of that is because they have not been experiencing racism in France. So if we say it's not that the French are not racist, Then why? This is your question of the day. What is going on? Why are African American soldiers not experiencing racism in France? So the question again, so this is the question of the day, is why are African American soldiers not experiencing racism in France during the First World War? I just want your hypothesis. If you had to guess, why are they not experiencing racism in France? Okay. Oh, see, I love these answers. Oh, Jonathan, I could teach an entire class just on your answer. It's true. The question is, why are African Americans not experiencing racism in France during World War One? We said it's not that the French are not racist. We're going to talk about how racist they are, but why are African Americans not experiencing that racism? I love it. Some of you are like, I can tell whether you're more of a realist or a pessimist. Your answer. Yeah, so a lot of you have hit on the different parts of why African Americans are not experiencing. But yeah, a lot of these African American soldiers are not experiencing racism while in France. That is a very real, excuse me, this is sliding up. That is a very real experience that some of these men have. And some of them, it'll be a huge contrast to the kind of racism they experience when they come back to the US, right? When they come back at the end of the war, a lot of these soldiers will contrast their experience in France to the experience they're having in the US. And they say, wait, why was I being treated better in France than I am in my own country? Yeah. Okay. Before I answer this question, so if anybody hasn't answered, keep sending your answers in. We'll come back to all the different answers there because I want to talk a little bit about the racism that existed in Europe during World War I, since large part of the war is being fought in Europe. We need to talk about some of that. First, the largest empire at this time was the British Empire, right? The British held the largest amount of colonies. Throughout the 19th century, the Europeans are in a kind of race to who can control the most colonies. And really, it's very clear that although the French and the British are competing, that Britain has the largest piece of the world. They're controlling larger parts of the world. And initially, you see them trying to use the colonies to their advantage, right? They want an all-volunteer army, and why not use men from the colonies that they have access to? In places like Jamaica, the war was actually really popular. So, for example, that's part of the reason why you can go to Jamaica now and English is spoken in Jamaica. It's because it was a British colony, right? Immediately in 1914, in the outbreak of the war, there was what people call war fever in Jamaica. People were excited. There were Jamaican men trying to volunteer to serve in the British military. And it's really interesting. A lot of it in Jamaica seems to be because of a extremely positive feeling towards Queen Victoria. Now, Queen Victoria is not queen during World War One, but Queen Victoria had overseen the end of slavery in Jamaica, right? It's during her reign that Jamaica ends slavery and the slave trade. And so because of that, then in Jamaica, there's a lot of positive feelings towards the British in terms of that. They also see the British Empire as one of emancipation, right? They say, aha, the British at least have ended slavery, whereas the Germans, they associate with tyranny and with militarism. Yeah, Jackson, exactly. And this is and why why are large parts of like Africa English speaking or French speaking? Because of colonialism. Yeah. So for Jamaicans, when they look at the two sides of the war, the Germans look like the bad guys, and the British look like the good guys, and they have all these positive ideas of Queen Victoria. And so immediately there's this moment in 1914 in which Jamaicans are in support of the war and they're signing up, volunteering for the British military. For a lot of Jamaicans, though, it's also employment opportunities. Jamaica had a large unemployment problem in 1914. There was a lot of unemployment. The outbreak of war means jobs, either in Britain, right? Because if all the British men are supposed to be fighting in the military, then who's going to work the British factories? Women, but also people from the colonies have the opportunity to go to Britain and work in the factories. So it means access to jobs. Also access to jobs within the British military. If you could as a soldier and other positions that were opening up in the British military. So the war brings jobs to Jamaicans, right? However, the British really quickly find out that people don't want soldiers from the colonies. They try at first, not with Jamaican soldiers, but the first colonial soldiers to fight in World War I were actually Indian soldiers from India, which was at the time the largest British colony, right? So they bring men from India to fight in the trenches in France, and the British public there's a huge backlash from the British public to these Indian soldiers. And part of the reason is that most people view World War I, at the start of World War I, as a white man's war, right? It's a war between brothers or cousins at least, right? The Germans and the French and the British, although they might have hundreds of years of a history of fighting against each other, they see each other as part of the same European family, right? And they say, this is one white country at war with another white country. Why are you bringing these Black and brown men to fight in Europe? The other thing is that that's a big taboo. In a colonial system, right, in all of these colonies, whether they're British, German, or French colonies, the colonial subjects, the people living in the colonies, are not legally allowed to have guns and weapons. Right? They're not legally, because of the fear that the colonial subjects, that these people are going to use the weapons, the guns, against the Europeans. Right? So in the colonies, who gets to own guns is tightly controlled. Colonial subjects are not allowed to own guns, right? Here, though, in the war, in order to use these men from the colonies, you have to arm them and train them. It means giving them guns, training them to do it, and then telling them to kill other white men. Right? If the British use troops from India, for example, or Jamaica, they're arming these men and telling them it's okay to kill a white German. And that's a huge taboo, right? In the colonies, that would never be allowed, right? If a Black or brown man in a colony killed a white man, what's going to happen to him? Even if it's justified, if it's self-defense. In a colony, yeah, that is a death sentence. It is very clear. In a colony, they're not allowed to do that. So in the context of World War I, initially, the British have a huge backlash to the use of colonial troops. So they try initially not to use troops from the colony. Those first Indian troops are sent to North Africa. But however, because of the nature of World War I, they need more men, right? Trench warfare is brutal. You have men sitting for long periods of time in trenches. When given the order to go over the top, right, they jump over the trenches, attack the other side, and they might gain a little bit. You might gain a few inches, but then the other side counterattacks, pushes them back, and really it's both sides fighting over a chunk of land, no man's land. But there's not any significant movement. For years of World War I, there's not significant movement between the two sides. And in the meantime, soldiers are dying. They keep dying in large numbers, and both sides need more and more men. So it becomes a necessity that the British have to accept that they're going to need some men from the colony. So they initially try a West India regiment, right? West India regiment. But they're afraid to station these men in France. So at first they try them out in Egypt. Right. This is how we also end up with an Egypt controlled by the British. But they send them to fight during World War in Egypt. They fight so well that then they extend the fighting of colonial troops in the British military. But initially, it's something that they have to sell. They have to sell the idea of colonial soldiers to the British public. This is a picture of Indian soldiers in the trenches of World War I. Right. So in Britain now, they have a lot of debates about like immigrants living in Britain and how they fit into British society. But a lot of those Indian immigrants, for example, probably have a history of their relatives having fought on the British side during World War I. Not all, but there is this history that's often forgotten in Britain. Now, the French don't have as many problems with using the colonies. The French immediately, part of it is that the war is fought so much on French soil, and that the casualties on the French side are so high right away. Right? In total, about 8 million men fight for France. About 500,000 were colonial subjects from North Africa, West Africa, Indochina, which was the name of Vietnam when it was a French colony, and Madagascar. About 20,000 from the Caribbean islands and the smaller possessions in India. So from the island of Reunion, Guyana, which is South America, but then Martinique and Guadeloupe in the Caribbean. And again, the French did have a small possession in India. And again, part of it is the French they needed every soldier they could get. So right away, they are recruiting men from the colonies, and they're doing it, right? There are volunteers from all of these places serving in the French military. They're serving in the trenches. They're serving in North Africa. They're serving everywhere where that is needed, right? However, they're segregated in the French army. Right? Initially, a lot of these colonial troops are not being used for soldiery. They're being used to do some of the dirtier work, right? To do some of the digging of trenches, the cleaning up of things, of moving goods from one place to the next. Initially, they're not allowed to actually serve as soldiers. And you might think that seems like a good thing, except that in order to advance, in order to have a career in the military, you need to serve in a military capacity. You need to actually fight in the warfare. Also, fighting in the warfare means better access to better pay and to better services. So a lot of these soldiers are actually not happy just being used to do the dirty work of the military. They signed up to fight, and that's how they're going to get the benefits that were promised to them and to their family. So just using them to do that dirty work is not enough. They never serve in a mixed race mixed race units. They're always segregated. Initially, too, they're used in the front lines. Whenever there's an attack, they will put the colonial troops first. Once they finally agree to let these men actually fight, they have them go first on an attack. Because that means that whoever's at the very front at an attack is going to suffer the highest casualties. And the French see this as, okay, by using the colonial troops, we're going to save French lives. White French soldiers are not going to die at higher rates. And instead, we're going to let the colonial troops die at higher rates. Yeah, and this is a long history of racism in France. So yeah, Antoinette is saying they weren't experience. Oh, it's the answer to the other question. Never mind. Okay. Also, so let's look at the promises that the French made these men. They promised them pay, right? Some of these men are doing it for the money. Do you think these men get all the money they were promised?
No.
They do not. It's not actually until like 2003, something like that, that finally the French finished paying all the money they owed the soldiers. At that point, these soldiers are long dead, right? These are men who fought in World War I. Most of the soldiers are dead by the time they finish paying off the money they owed them. They also promised pensions. Right after serving in the war.
Was that because of they didn't have the money at the time, or they were just being stingy?
So there was a problem of money, but they were just being stingy. They were less likely to pay the men from the colonies than they were the French soldiers, the white soldiers. And even after, this we're talking about into the next century, they were still not paying the money they owed, because even if a soldier died, their family was supposed to get their pension or the pay for their service. And a lot of those families never see any of that money. And it was just out of racism. Because some of the white soldiers are also not paid because of the lack of money after World War I. But they fight for those pensions, they fight for that money, and most of the French white soldiers do end up eventually getting at least most of the money, and the colonial soldiers don't get it until like 2003, something like that. And it was because of a movie. In the early 2000s, a movie called Indigènes. So this is the French name for colonial troops, troupes indigènes. There's a movie called Indigènes that comes out, and when the president of France sees that movie, he finally finishes paying the money owed to those troops. The other thing that was promised to some of these soldiers was citizenship. This was a huge motivator for a lot of these men, is a French citizenship. And that is also denied at the end of World War I. Most of these men then don't end up getting any of the things that was promised to them. Was the movie that good? It is a pretty good movie. Actually, it's a very good. I'm trying to look at my shelf to see if I can pull it out. I have a copy of it. Because it showed troops from all the colonies fighting for France, and it shows how badly they were treated in the French military, and it shows them sacrificing their lives for France, right? So apparently it was at least good enough that it moved the French president at the time. This is like a photo of Senegalese soldiers with their families in France. right? This is actually quite rare, though, that a Senegalese family is in France. Most of these troops from the colonies that fought in the French military are not allowed to go back home, right? If they were serving from Martinique, from Guadeloupe, from Algeria, most of these soldiers are not allowed when they have their breaks, right? When they're on leave, they're not allowed to go back to their countries. They have to take their breaks, their leaves in France. So it is quite rare to see an entire Senegalese family on French soil, but this one was in Marseille. Somehow this soldier was able to get their family there. As a result, though, there are really interesting dynamics happening during the war, right? In a sense, because the focus is on the war effort, a lot of the social and cultural aspects are not being as tightly regulated, right? For the first time, you have men from the colonies in really large numbers in France. Since they're not being allowed to go back home, they're in France. And what happens when you have a whole bunch of men who are fighting in the war taking a break in Paris? They're looking to relax, to have some fun. Who are they going to have fun with in Paris? Any ideas? French women, exactly. So you get a large number of interracial relationships during the war. And the women actually had no problem with their skin color. A lot of them have kids. A lot of them marry some of these French women. The racism is something they have to overcome. But for a lot of these women in the middle of the war, there's nobody telling them don't do that. And who are they having relationships? Well, these are soldiers in French uniforms. They're French soldiers. And it's the first time that you have a large amount of sexual relationships between Black and brown men and French women. In the colonies, this would have never been allowed, right? This is one of the biggest taboos. In all of these colonies, there are laws prohibiting marriages and just sex between Black and brown men and white French women. It's part of the reason why, like, white French women, you don't see a lot of them in the colonies. The French government is purposely trying to keep these groups apart for fear of, diluting the white race. So, but during the war, people are kind of too busy fighting to regulate these relationships, and they actually occur in really insignificant numbers. So back to the American soldiers, back to the African American soldiers, right? They're not experiencing, from the French at least, the racism of the military, right? And a lot of the African American soldiers don't even see the racism that the colonial troops are experiencing, right? They just don't see it, right? Instead, they think they're experiencing a France that is not racist, right? It's just their experience. Part of the reason for that, which a lot of you got in your answer to the question, is because they're American. And this is something that a lot of African Americans who go to France throughout history experience. They experience less racism in France. And some of that is because of their Americanness. Right? Remember that by the time the US enters the war in World War I, the French need help. Right? The French, allied with the British, have been fighting this war against the Germans. The Russians are out. The Russian Revolution has broken out, and the Russians are out of the war. So it's the French and the British against the Germans, and they're still stuck in the stalemate, not doing well. They need the U.S. to come in. So when the U.S. finally enters the war, it is a huge moment of celebration for the French. So in that moment, the French don't care about African American soldiers. They care that these are American soldiers coming to help them win the war. And that positive feeling towards Americans is something that, like James Baldwin, when he goes to France, experiences to some extent. He also sees the way the racism works in France, but there is a feeling of, hey, I can be more free in France than I can be in the US. It's something I've experienced. People sometimes look at me weird when I tell them, but I have never felt more American than when I've been in France. I've also never felt more Mexican than when I've been in France. Both I have there's something about traveling abroad that like makes your identities feel more pronounced. But one of the experiences I've had in France is staying in a town called Angers. It looks in English, it says Angers. And I was staying with a woman, a French woman there, who was very excited to have an American student stay with her. And she took me to visit her neighbors. Like she took me on this tour of the town, visiting her neighbors. And she was always introducing me as the American student that I was staying with her. Oh, the American student, the American student. The first time I went to France was during the Bush administration, and there was a lot of tension between France and the US during the Bush administration because France did not support the US with the war in Iraq. And French people that wanted to talk to me often stopped me and asked me, so why did you all vote for Bush? So American students, when you travel abroad, you become a representative of your country, right? And the whatever the political dynamic. So I've never felt more American than France. They a lot of times don't like, they didn't care that I wasn't born in the US. I was the American student. I'm like, and I told you I also never felt more Mexican. I was in France, and part of that was because I've been in France during the World Cup. And seeing Mexico play and seeing like the Mexican flags all over Paris when Mexico was playing really made me feel extremely Mexican. Yeah, Jackson, that was a lot of the things during the Bush administration. Yeah, that's the case a lot of people tried to make to the French. We actually didn't vote, but then you have to explain the Electoral College to people or explain the Supreme Court to people because, okay, if most Americans didn't vote for Bush, then how come he's president? So it was a lot of American students during those years would put Canadian flags on their like backpacks and I would carry Canadian flags to try to like distance themselves from their Americanness. I didn't travel to Europe during the Trump years, but I imagine there were probably similar dynamics during the Trump years. On the other hand, during the Obama years, the French loved Obama, like loved him. So they like loved America. I also went to France during the Obama years, and there was a very different feeling, less kind of shame of being American during those years. So let's see, what else did you all say in the comments? Let me look at the comments again. So a lot of you were right, though. A lot of this feeling for African American soldiers is that they're being treated like Americans, not like Black Americans. They're being treated like Americans, and that was something that was new to a lot of them, right? Especially a lot of these African American soldiers that were coming from the South. Right? If you have lived your whole life in a segregated South, where racism is a part of your everyday experience, and you're in France for the first time, and the French people are celebrating you, French women are looking at you as sexually attractive, they want sexual relationships with you, and nobody is telling you that that's not okay, or there's no threat of violence for looking at a white woman for the first time, then that is experienced as something extremely positive, right? So it's not the French people not being racist, it's this particular dynamics. It's a very specific kind of dynamic occurring. Right? Because of that, right, when a lot of these African American soldiers return to the US, having experienced that kind of celebration abroad, right, being celebrated by the French people, not being treated with racism by the French, means that they're not happy to come back to a segregated United States. It's a significant shift, right? And this is not something that was planned. This is something that thousands of people individually make the decision to leave the South. They can no longer stay in a segregated American South, right? You see this in the numbers, right? Chicago alone was one of the places that a lot of African Americans move to. They're leaving the South, and one of the places they're going to is Chicago. In the year 1900, there were around 30,000 Black people in Chicago. So there were Black people in Chicago, but by 1920, so in the couple of years after World War I, the Black population in Chicago skyrockets to about 109,000 Black people in Chicago, and growing, because the number of Black people going to Chicago was still growing at that time. Right, so it's a big deal. Now, they're not just going to Chicago; they're also going to New York. They're coming to San Francisco, to Los Angeles. They're going to northern cities in the West, primarily going to cities, right? Places even in the Midwest. Kansas City is experiencing also a population boom from African Americans moving to those cities. And they are not experiencing the same kind of segregation that they experienced in the South. But are they experiencing any racism? Oh, Jackson, that's a great question. Why Chicago in particular? Jobs. There were a lot of factory jobs and those kinds of job opportunities in Chicago, because there was a large city, and there was a large, like during the war, it was a place where a lot of those military factories spring up, where they were based at, and a lot of those factories end up becoming like car factories or other kinds of manufacturing. So it's just a place where there are jobs for people to go to. Yeah. But are they experiencing no racism when they move to these places? No. Right. One of the major problems that this huge migration of African Americans out of the South, one of the major problems they're experiencing anywhere they're going to, this was especially true in Chicago, is housing. Where are you going to live? Right? That's one of the first things when you move somewhere that you need to solve. Where am I going to live? Well, in Chicago, even though there was no legal segregation, right? There's no Jim Crow laws in Chicago. What they're experiencing is redlining and housing discrimination. A Black family cannot rent an apartment in a building that housed primarily white people. Not allowed. If you had the money to buy a house, you couldn't buy a house in a white neighborhood. It doesn't matter if you could afford it. If you were Black, you're not allowed to. So there wasn't that legal Jim Crow laws, the legal segregation wasn't there, but the policies meant that Chicago was still being heavily segregated, right? Even though they're finding jobs in places like Chicago, where they might not have back in the South, right? One, they're not getting paid the same as white workers. Huge problem was pay equity. Black workers were being paid less than white workers that were doing the exact same job. They were not being allowed to unionize. There were already unions forming in a lot of these places in Chicago, but these were white unions. These were white unions, and Black people were being excluded from the union. So even if you were working in the same factory, you were not allowed to join the union if you were Black. There's also just the plain out violence of it all. There was this backlash in these places from the white population. They see the number of Black people coming in, and they freak out over their city becoming more Black. and they try to frighten Black people away from these places by bombing Black homes. So you might not have the official KKK in these places, but their behavior is the same as the kind of violence that's being experienced in the South: the bombing of homes, the beating up of people, murders for no reason. Yeah, the housing problem. And by the way, we think that, oh well, this was back then, not anymore. A lot of this redlining of not allowing Black people to buy houses in certain places was occurring until very recently, the 80s, 90s. Even now, they have done several studies of the way we evaluate the value of homes, right? When you're going to sell your home, you have to decide what the correct price is to sell it at. And some of that means bringing an expert in to evaluate the home and give it a price, right? Well, they have found that when the evaluator comes into a house and it's clearly owned by a Black family, like they see the pictures of Black faces on the walls, that they tend to evaluate the home as being worth less than it actually is. And people have done the experiment themselves, but studies have also shown that, yeah, Black homes get to be valued at less than they actually are. That a white family trying to sell the exact same home, or when the evaluator doesn't see evidence of a Black family living there, they tend to give it a higher value. It's really infuriating. But this is part of the beginning of the Great Migration at the end, during and at the end of World War I, with large number of people. And it's really like, it's a huge movement of people, right? When you look at like just one city, how you have like over 100,000 people coming into a city that are new to the city. And this is happening all over the US without it being coordinated, right? There's nobody sending out flyers amongst Black families in the South. There's nobody telling people to do this. It's just people choosing to do it on their own all over the American South, right? So it's really quite extraordinary. There are very few moments in human history when you have this, people in large numbers doing the same thing and doing it in really, really high numbers, because this changes the demographics of the nation. Right? Places where there had been Black people, but there just hadn't been as many, all of a sudden turn cities, right? So all of a sudden cities like Chicago become largely Black cities, right? Places like Harlem. Harlem was a white neighborhood in New York. It was a white neighborhood before the Great Migration, and it becomes a Black neighborhood. Right? You see it if you look at the documents of HOAs, like homeowners organizations in Harlem. There was this Harlem Property Owners Improvement Corporation, in Harlem, that freaks out and begins like fear mongering about, hey, Black people are taking over Harlem. We need to stop this. And they try to do it through housing discrimination, increasing rents, through violence as well. But in a lot of these places, they're just not ever able to stop it, right? They're just not able to stop it. The number of Black people just continues to increase, and basically their worst fears become true, right? Harlem becomes a Black place. And Harlem in particular becomes the center of Black culture in between the wars, right? The Harlem Renaissance, jazz, right? The jazz that most people listen to comes out of the Harlem Renaissance and out of Harlem being a Black place where musicians get together, develop the music and promote it. And Black people listening to it at such large numbers that even white people begin listening to this Black music, right? Black poetry blossoms in Harlem. Black authors, a lot of Black authors that become famous in that after World War II, a lot of that is developed in Harlem during the interwar period. Black nationalism and Black capitalism also comes out of this great migration, and places like Harlem becoming Black towns, right? Marcus Garvey was one of the first most prominent proponents of Black nationalism. And he was, oh, never mind, my time's up. Nobody has stopped me. It's 1:30. I need to stop. I will talk about Marcus Garvey next time we all talk. So I will stop the recording.